I'm Rory Sweeney, creator of the Mutual Dream Experiment, and this with me today is Robert Waggoner, author of the famous book Lucid Dreaming, Gateway to the Inner Self. And we're here today to talk about our current state of being. And looking at that, we have two, polar expressions of that. Currently, the Western technology of modern science is telling us that the universe exploded outwards from a single Big Bang, and that all of the energy and mass and so forth that has erupted from this Big Bang is, although somewhat separate in terms of its expression, is effectively coming from the same source and is connected at the quantum level. Now, on the other hand, your experience and my experience has something different to say. That is to say, there's something almost fundamentally individual about my experience of the world versus your experience of the world. And so therefore, although we're being prescribed this sense of interconnectivity among everything in the universe, there is the sense that somehow there is a feeling of disconnection, perhaps. So what we have in effect are these two opposite ends of the spectrum, and I guess the question therefore is, where on this spectrum does lucid dreaming fit? Does it offer us some kind of a philosophical bridge between these two states of being?
You know, in my experience it does. I think you can use lucid dreaming not only to discover the layers of the self, you can use out-of-body experiences to encounter the dimensions of actuality, but if you keep going deeper into the layers of the self, you finally get to the point that I did after 20 years of lucid dreaming, which is wanting to go beyond lucid dreaming. And when I did that, by letting go of self-ideation and beliefs and expectations, all that mental stuff, when I totally emptied the mind, that's when I had an experience of what you might call interconnected oneness or non-duality. So there's many ways that you can use lucid dreaming to encounter various aspects, but if you want to go to the deepest depth, I think that's when you're letting go of self and coming to the experience of non-duality.
So two words that come to mind there, self and duality, seem to be very much at the forefront of what you're trying to express with there. So self, in essence, is an expression of duality because self implies other, of course.
Exactly.
And therefore that's precisely what we're experiencing. We experience things as being left or right.
Right.
We experience self and other, black and white and so forth.
Right.
But we may also say that self implies other, that you couldn't have the self coming into being without the experience of the other, no more so than you couldn't have left coming onto the stage of the universe and right following on 5 minutes later. It just wouldn't make any sense. So there seems to be a kind of an inherent entanglement between these two opposite states of what we would call perhaps mutually exclusive and mutually interdependent. They seem to be entangled in some kind of bizarre dance, and that bizarre dance is the proverbial dream that we're experiencing right now, if I might put it that way to you.
Yeah. You know, oftentimes our language too makes it even difficult to talk about non-duality because our language is set up in a subject-object sort of sense. Mm-hmm. I saw you, you did this, subject-object. But in a non-dual experience, no subject-object relationship exists. It's basically an interconnected oneness. The oneness exists. I was recently at a conference where the final speaker was talking about non-duality and how he had never had that experience, but he thought if he did have that experience, the feeling that would be there would be love. And I just want to tell you, Rory, from the experience that I recall, in non-duality, no feelings exist, because feelings involve relationships.
Right.
Without relationships, no feelings can be in place. And so if you ask a Zen master or just a wise person, you know, what's the feeling within non-duality? I'll just tell you, from my experience, no feeling exists because nothing relates.
Now, I think you've touched something there rather daringly, if I may say so. And I too have had non-dualistic awareness. My personal encounter with this experience was very much contrary to what one might have anticipated, having been told by many people who claim to have had the experience that there's nothing but a feeling of love. I didn't feel any love. Now, I'm not saying that in a bad way. I really didn't. On the contrary, I found the whole experience rather alarming, very disconcerting, frankly. What I personally found, and this is quite a sharing for me to bring this up right now, I didn't think we'd go here so quick, but here we are. The thing that I found was that it was an overwhelming lack of meaning, because meaning was something implied by the idea of there being me and something else, the contrast what I identify myself as being with.
Right.
And if everything is one thing, then how is there any meaning there? There simply isn't meaning. It just isn't there.
Right, exactly. So feelings and meanings, all as you suggest, imply relationships.
Mm-hmm.
What does exist, I feel, in non-duality or this interconnected oneness is knowing.
Now,
knowing exists.
I will concur with that.
So knowing exists apart from relating. Knowing exists apart from feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing exists. And basically awareness in the process of knowing awareness. But since it's all the same awareness, there's no relationship in that fundamental sense of feeling or meaning. So yeah, that's an excellent point that you brought up, because besides feeling not existing there, meaning doesn't. Now, the thing of it is, in our waking ego life, we find that alarming.
We do, and I can tell you my own personal experience of it was an overwhelming feeling that somehow I had lifted the lid on this secret I wasn't supposed to discover, and here I was sitting there like somebody had literally desaturated the color from my universe or something, and now I was going to be left with this very meaningless, empty experience, somewhat akin to what one might describe as the proverbial depersonalization that the psychotic encounters with the likes.
Yeah.
I think this little guy's got something to say to us.
Oh, there's a spider come down.
There's a spider come down.
Yeah. I feel something coming out of my left ear, and so I think this is the spider that weaves the world together, and we're all a part of its web.
The web.
But in any case, I do want to say that we have to realize that from the ego perspective, some of this does sound alarming.
It does. It does.
It's nice to think of feeling, the love of a mother for a child, or the love of the divine creator for its creation, and all that stuff. And so I'm not saying that does not exist.
Of course.
But I am saying that in the interconnected oneness, when you get to source, meaning and feeling fundamentally have no existence. Because in the interconnected oneness and that non-duality, those things only make sense when dual things relate, when dual things interact. And so in that state, it's just not going to be there. But it is one of those things that for our ego might be a little bit alarming.
I think it's terribly alarming. I think that people often accuse Zen of being very bland, and I think that certainly if you understand Zen, bland as it may seem, it's just what it is.
Right. I read a great quote in a book by Gene Roberts the other day, and the quote was, "Love even the transitory because it's the face of the permanent." And so what the basic fundamental thing is that non-duality and interconnected oneness can be a wonderful source by which existence springs into being. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that we should therefore devalue existence. Mm-hmm. Instead, we should see this existence as part of this larger creativity and growing and value fulfillment that we're coming in and developing. And so we should take part in it more thoughtfully, mm-hmm. and realize ourselves within it more correctly. And so the position is not to head back to Source. Source doesn't need our help. Mm-hmm. Source doesn't need anything from us. Mm-hmm. Source will continue to exist whether mm-hmm. or not we're here or not.
Absolutely.
But our thing is, in this waking world, to express our knowing and express this larger oneness by being supportive of each other, by moving things along, by awakening people to the larger nature of reality, mm-hmm. and then just letting creativity create.
Well, I'm glad you brought it back on point there. Pardon the intrusion of cats. We got cats, spiders, you know, we got an entire zoo here.
Exactly.
So one may ask me, well, what is it exactly you get from this discovering of Source if fundamentally you discover that there's no meaning behind meaning, that ultimately it's nothing but some transitory arbitration we place on our existence? And I'll have to concur with what you're saying, which is that we are discovering the nature of self and other as being nothing more than illusory, and hence how we interact with each other therefore becomes very different. When you dip your toe in the source, as I said, from my own point of view, it wasn't quite the Buddha awakening I expected. On the contrary, it was a rather alarming experience. I think existential isolation was the words that poured out of my mouth at the time. I was terrified of the whole thing. But on the other hand, what I found was that I had a huge sense of compassion for what I perceive to be the other, in that what I understand the other to be is another aspect of me.
Right.
And when I see the other in a state of frustration, I know that it's because the other is in a sense of delusion about their true self, and hence we have jealousy, we have identity, we have ego, we have hatred, we have desire, we have all these kind of polar expressions of the self that people encounter with such, with such a pinballing mechanism, whereby when fundamentally you have dissolved that illusion, it doesn't mean you don't necessarily experience those things, it's just that you experience them with less momentum.
So I think those are lovely observations, because one thing, think of the Big Bang, think of interconnected oneness, a Tao, a non-duality, that then for some purpose, for some inner reckoning, decides to express itself in subject and object in duality. And that's when that happens, when it suddenly shifts and begins this creative process, I think that's when the love comes in. That's when the mother's creative feeling for your child, that it become the best that it can be, that it explore all its potential, that it express itself however it can. That's when that occurs, when that shift happens. Mm-hmm. And so I remember one time when I was a young guy, just kind of a mystical little teenager, I asked myself, what are we doing here? Why are we here? And I heard my inner self tell me, beings wish to be.
I love that.
And so that's where it's all going. It's all about creativity. So mm-hmm. So for those people who are listening, I don't think there's anyone there who's going to judge us. There's not anyone who's going to condemn us or anything like that. The thing of it is, for all of us in each of our life, is to express our creativity, mm-hmm. reach our full potential, mm-hmm. let go of limiting beliefs, mm-hmm. and access our larger knowing, and mm-hmm. then we'll be, basically on the right path.
Because fundamentally, that's what is going on, creativity, right?
Exactly. And when you look at energy, what's energy all about? Energy is constantly transformative, it's mm-hmm. constantly mingling, tearing mm-hmm. apart, doing all these things. When you look at the nature of human experience, basically what you're seeing is the characteristics of energy mm-hmm. being expressed in human form.
Absolutely.
So that's where it's all going. So it's fine that non-duality and interconnected oneness don't have feeling and don't have meaning, mm-hmm. but as soon as that dual expression occurred, now you got to run with the program, which is creativity, expression, dropping limiting beliefs, and basically understanding your mother.
Okay, so Terence McKenna, I think, really put a nice turn of phrase on that when he said, what therefore is the point and how do we express it? And the word he used was art. Because I think what art is ultimately is the celebration of the lack of boundaries of our existence. It is the celebration of there being a lack of any rules, because that's really what creativity is. It's about breaking the patterns. And certainly McKenna talked a lot about the idea that the two kind of intercourses of the universe being habit and what he referred to as novelty. And what he believes is that there is a slight lean towards novelty within the universal system, and hence the fact that what we started off with was a relatively simple plasma of electronic activity, which is now complexified into atomic chemistry and molecular chemistry, biological chemistry, silicon technology, language, right. You and me, and so forth. Right. So what we're seeing is a kind of an outward trajectory towards higher levels of complexity. Right. And certainly what we see when complexity comes on stage is that each generation informs the next generation with a greater degree of force. So there's a natural kind of an exponential effect to that. That is to say that we are building on layers of technology onto layers of technology, which essentially are layers of creativity onto layers of creativity. Right. And so we are, in that regard, being thrust into further creativity by the very force of the universe. And when we embrace that, I think that that's when we're being truly, that's when we're being truly human, to be creative.
Right. You know, and also I think you see that in the progression of basically how the human species relate. I mean, you know, first it was, let's say, just a bunch of cavemen hanging out in a cave. Then they make a tribe. Then the tribe comes together, maybe in a confederation. Then they develop a city. Then the city develops a country. Then the country develops a United Nations. And then we're finally getting to this point where we're kind of seeing us all as an interconnected oneness. And that's the strange thing. We come from this incredible source, get diversified into 5 billion people and all the other awarenesses, the cats and all the other things that exist out there. But finally, a lot of people are going, wait a second, we exist within an interconnected system, and if we don't honor that and use our creativity to make that happen as best it can, we're going to be one of those species who you just read about in the dictionaries and won't exist anymore.
So I'm going to make a proposal to you in that regard. You know, we like to try to own our technological advances as something we came up with.
Right.
We might, for example, suggest that we created the internet, but I think to say we created the internet is about as naive as saying we created language. Now, I'm not sure how we created language. I think that nature is not mute. I think that nature is fundamentally woven into every single cell in our bodies, and of course it is, because as we've already said, it's all one. And you know, what is happening is that we had fallen into such a degree of identity separation. We had fallen into religion, into politics, into countries. I mean, the land masses of our planet had divided so much. The cultural divides had become so strong in our world that I think nature simply said, you know what, you're not getting this. And that's when the internet, telecommunications specifically, of course, what triggers the internet, starts to emerge in our consciousness. Right. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we did come up with telecommunication as a concept. I don't think necessarily it was any different to language emerging into our psyche, if such a thing was possible.
Right.
And I think here we are, as you said correctly, identifying the internet as a way to communicate with each other, to dissolve those boundaries, that I could be sitting here talking to you and people back in their homes can watch this video as if they were here joining us. And that's really, really crucial when you think about it. I mean, right now, we are literally demonstrating this interconnected state of consciousness. Right. And I think that is what is happening. You're seeing it in the language patterns of people in the world. We're starting to understand the word interconnected. It's an expression you hadn't heard 20 years ago, but now is the order of the day.
Yeah, exactly. And also I think it's bringing up, as you say, the internet brings up similarly this idea of the collective unconscious. Carl Jung brought it up. He kind of modified his position on it occasionally after some criticism. But oftentimes when you read his works, it sounds like what he's basically talking about is some sub-layer of aware communication that exists at a subliminal level. And of course, in the internet, you can point to servers and this and that and computer terminals and you have the internet. But on the other hand, when you look at something like dreams and mutual dreams, then you get to this point where you start to really wonder, wait a second, is there truly a collective unconscious? Is there something like a universal mind, not only where dreamers can relate to dreamers, but also dreamers in the Aboriginal sense can relate to the dream time, to the awareness of the rocks and mountains and other species that share their space. And so that's the thing that I think as dreamers and lucid dreamers that we bring to the equation. We have a different way and a new way and a scientifically valid way to explore this inner dimension and see, can there be something there that'll bring value and new levels of creativity and growth to the human experience by exploring that?
So yes is the answer. I think you've probably asked what I believe to be the most fundamental question in our current state of consciousness, which is it possible for you and I to mutually share a dream experience and then to confirm that subsequently? And as you are no doubt aware, I have devised a password system which will be on the internet, which, without me going into the details, it's the Mutual Dream Experiment. You find it at wakeupinyourdreams.com, where in effect it was something that was very much inspired by your work with Ed Kellogg in your book, which I'm sure you'll talk about in a moment. I think there's probably not a lucid dreamer of any serious ability that hasn't read that book and hasn't consider that chapter between you and Ed Kellogg as probably being the most pertinent in terms of the Inquisition, which is it possible for you and I to have a dream tonight, to have a conversation in that dream, and to wake up tomorrow morning and say, yes, I recall it, you recall it, we can exchange details and we can both concur that it was in fact a mutual dream. I think that is absolutely the most relevant question we can ask right now, and the people to answer that question are the people with the ability to lucid dream. So maybe you tell us a little bit more about your own experience with that.
Yeah. So mutual dreaming and mutual lucid dreaming, I feel, exists as a fascinating possibility for all of us to consider and explore. Now, probably the first person who really took this seriously and wrote a book about it was this woman, Linda Magallon, lives in the Bay Area in the U.S. She and her research just focused on mutual dreaming, so she included dreams in which perhaps you and I would exchange some information, even though we weren't technically lucid. And then the next day I might call you up. So she figured that there were two types of mutual dreams. There's meeting dreams, where, for example, I might see Rory, and I'll see Rory doing something, with two Siamese cats.
Sure.
And in the morning I wake up and I go, hey Rory, I saw that your cat was walking around with a broken leg. And you go, oh my God, yesterday the cat did something stupid and broke its leg. And then you'd have some validation that a meeting dream occurred. But then she said there were another type of mutual dreams called meshing dreams. And this is where you get information even though I don't technically see you. It's like I get information that I can validate later on that has something to do with you, but you and I don't share the same dreamscape. And so it's interesting to think that in your project in wakeupinyourdreams.com, it's, as I understand it, the idea is to pass a password on in your dream state. And so you might not technically see the dreamer.
Sure.
You might hear a voice announcing something and just wake up and say, hey, someone was yelling Chardonnay, or this guy asked me 5 times, did I want Chardonnay? And it made absolutely no sense. And so you might not even know who's giving you the password, and you might totally neglect him. And so in that kind of thing, you're meshing, the dream energies are meshed together, but there's not really a meeting occurring per se.
So I guess, and I'm going to be frank, the risk perhaps is that we want to avoid the dilemma that remote dreaming has kind of tied itself up with, which is the idea that one can, let's say, target, for example, a bottle of Chardonnay. Now somebody says, well, I saw a bottle, it wasn't, I don't remember what it was, or I saw somebody drinking beer on the street, so maybe that's what it was. And then confabulation, false memories, and all sorts of stuff comes into it. And certainly any kind of scientifically controlled experiment wouldn't allow that necessarily to fly. Now, I'm certainly not dismissing any of those encounters. On the contrary, I'm encouraging those encounters. Well, what I am encouraging people to do is try and take it a step further. If those encounters are valid, then it's a stepping stone towards something more substantial. What I would like people to do is specifically to meet just like you and me, to exchange the password between us just like you and me, and then to use the software system to say, what password specifically did you get from me when I met you? And when we did, what else did I say? Where were we? And the person will hopefully be able to tell you, well, you were in a railway station and you were dressed like this and so on. Likewise, we've used an anonymous mail exchange to help to validate the experience. So in other words, it's not that, well, when I met Robert, I know certain things about you and me, we've got a history and so on, and therefore that might colour the experience. We're purposely using an anonymous encounter. So when the person is prompted to discuss the password exchange, it's very much a case of, okay, well, what did you see? You don't know who's on either end of it. And I think that gives a different layer to it in terms of how we can actually investigate it. Now, somebody's probably going to say to me, there are many scientific flaws about the whole thing, and of course there are, but we're not here doing science a la 21st century. We're doing science a la 14th century, which was done in garden sheds in the back bedroom. And that's precisely where some of the best science has been done, historically speaking. Leonardo da Vinci was cutting up bodies when it was illegal to do so. And I like that. I like the fact that we're being, we're exploring questions that nobody else wants to ask, but are too afraid to ask, perhaps, in the same way that Leonardo da Vinci was cutting up bodies because the Catholic Church says it was wrong to do so. He was having to do it in secret. Right. Likewise, here we are standing in the face of contemporary science, saying, well, we don't necessarily agree with your point of view. We think there's something more to this. And if we do discover something, which I think we will, then it's up to us how we take that forward. And if we want to try and bring it into laboratories and try to demonstrate it and so forth, and no doubt in due course we will. I mean, I think the best example of, let me rephrase that, perhaps the best metaphor to express this is Keith Hearn's experiment in 1975 to prove that lucid dreaming was actually possible. I mean, 50 odd years ago, to describe the idea of being lucid in a dream to any kind of a scientist would have just been heresy.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they did it. They proved it.
Yeah.
And that to me says a lot.
Yeah. It's interesting. Ed Kellogg and Linda Maggione, the author of Mutual Dreaming, and I, we developed various experiments in mutual dreaming, and we did much like you're doing. On the appointed night, we would select a password from a list of 100 words.
Sure.
When you woke up in the morning, you would send all of your dreams to a fair witness. So you wouldn't send it to each other's to contaminate someone else's report. We'd send it all to a fair witness. And then once they'd all been compiled, then they'd be released. And I remember one time, the password that I had was grapes. And all of a sudden that night, Ed Kellogg became lucid. And so he called out to find me. And then he writes, and basically he describes the living room of my house and my wife. And I'm sitting there pouring Ed a glass of wine, even though Ed says, no need. And he keeps asking me for the password, but I just keep pouring wine. And so in the morning, when he woke up and looked at the list of 100 words, he said, well, I think Robert was sending grapes. And so he hit it head on. So what I'm saying to people is, you as the lucid dreamer might be able to find someone else in this experiment, and they might verbally say it, they might symbolically suggest it.
Semiotics are really important.
And so you have to realize that it's not going to be quite as clear as me handing you a note or me handing you a photo or something like that. It'll be symbolically expressed sometimes, and sometimes it'll be straight on literal.
So we do have a forum called the Dream Mosaic as well, where this is precisely what I'm encouraging people to do, to try to look for synchronicities, to try to look for any kind of coincidences, and then maybe to unravel things subsequently. Right. So I have encouraged people, if you do not receive a password, then don't be perturbed by that. In fact, it's just as important to go on to the Dream Mosaic, to put your dreams in there, to look at what other people are putting in there and see was there anything that you might encourage as a potential encounter. Because we really are only taking baby steps towards this right here. And as you said correctly, the language of the dream is very semiotic in its texture. A lot of the time I find when I'm lucid dreaming, I don't say a lot to anybody. It's all very much implied, and it's almost, people talk a lot about psychic language in lucid dreaming. You don't always speak to people in lucid dreams, as I'm sure you're aware yourself. A lot of the time you're just creating a kind of there's almost an implied relationship. Right. And certainly very much something that was very well versed in your book was the metaphorical expression of the dream itself. I mean, when you shouted out to the dream itself, you did hear a voice speaking back, a number of occasions. But on many occasions, it was the dream itself is speaking back in a whole metaphorical essay. Right. And I think that's extremely important. And of course, that does, from the point of view of passwords, makes it a lot more difficult. A lot of people have said to me that we should be trying to use symbols and this and that. Lots of suggestions have come in. And my answer to that so far has been, well, this is generation one. Good. So what we want to do is we want to get it out there, and we want to see where we think the activity is happening, and then we're going to try and change the direction of the thing. So likewise, I'm encouraging people to come in and say, well, we think you should do this, we think you should do that. and maybe try this and try that.
Right.
And hopefully their suggestions will fertilize and grow the process, because this is a philanthropic exercise. I mean, this is something we're doing to have people experience this for themselves. I mean,
Exactly.
this is just my way of saying to the world is, as you correctly said, when you have the non-dualistic sense of being, the first thing you want to come back and do is tell everybody about it. But you want to do so not so they can lose meaning in their lives, on the contrary, so they can have more meaning in their lives.
Right.
And that meaning comes from being more creative.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to be creative myself. And in the same way I'm being creative, I'm trying to encourage other people to be creative.
Right.
By getting into lucid dreaming, by understanding it, by having a motivation to get in there, by actually trying to have a goal in there.
Right.
And I think the password system is a goal. It may be a goal that's in very far out of reach at the moment, but it's a goal nonetheless. And I think, let's reach for it, see where it takes us.
Yeah. And to kind of help people along and give them some advice from the experiments that Ed Kellogg and I and Linda Maguillon and Beverly Kierdzierski d'Urso, who's kind of Stephen LaBerge's main lucid dream researcher. All of us have done this kind of mutual lucid dreaming kind of work. And so just to help people understand things, I want to talk a little bit about what Ed Kellogg told me in order to make us better mutual lucid dreamers. And so one thing he told me that he wanted everyone to realize is that he discovered there's something he called the substitution phenomenon.
Okay.
And so, for example, I might have a dream and there's a woman with me, but by the time I write up my dream report, I just call her my wife, Wendy.
Okay.
It's not that I turned and saw that it was my wife, Wendy. I just substituted, well, there was a woman there with me, and in my dream report, I call it my wife, Wendy. But technically, I never looked at her to confirm, yes, this is my wife, Wendy. So you have to be a little bit careful sometimes about the substitution phenomenon, because you can misidentify things that you really haven't, that you honestly don't know at a very basic level. Then he also, Ed wrote about something that he said that there are really three levels of the dream and the dream report. And if you don't mind, I'm just going
please, of course.
read from my book what Ed said here. So to understand the dream experience better, Ed Kellogg notes, in my experience, dreams like plays occur on at least three qualitatively different levels. First, the structural level that consists of the stage settings and props, the raw dreamscape before we project meaning onto it. This level makes up the substratum of the dream phenomenon, qua phenomenon. Second, the meaning level, in which symbols, feelings, and the relationships of the dream characters and objects predominates. And finally, most superficially, the labeling level, where we verbally interpret and identify what happens during a dream. Written and oral accounts usually focus on describing the labeling level of dreams, where we often boil down a multi-level experience into a few simplistic identifications. Many dream workers probe deeper and focus on the underlying meaning level of the dream. The structural level of the dream, the substratum, usually remains either unnoticed or ignored, but may prove the least idiosyncratic level of them all. As such, it may hold the key to providing the best evidence for dream mutuality. And then he talks about a dream he had of another person. He was lucidly aware, the other person seemed lucidly aware. They interacted in this desert environment. And so in the morning, he wrote his friend or called his friend and said, hey, did you have a lucid dream last night, and what happened? And so the friend, 2 weeks later, finally got back to him and gave him the account. But in Ed's dream, Ed identified it as Mexico, as a desert landscape in Mexico, and his friend identified it as a desert landscape in the Holy Land in Israel. And so you can see that at a structural level...
Yes, I see your point. I recall reading this actually, yeah. That's very interesting.
And in the meaning level, they're interacting in the desert level, but when Ed calls it Mexico, and his friend Harvey calls it the Holy Land, then that would lead someone to say, oh, they're not even in the same place. I mean, they're not even describing the same place.
Right.
But if you look at the structural meaning level, obviously they are. And so this is why I want lucid dreamers, you have to be very careful when you make your report. Just describe it. Just describe it. You can put in parentheses, it reminds me of Sussex or whatever, but just describe it. If it's a forest, just call it a forest. Don't say...
So I guess we should encourage a sense of detachment there at that level, really, because as you said, the likelihood is if one starts to contaminate the experiment with their own personal intuitions and feelings and so forth, they could very easily find themselves amplifying the wrong things and missing what was important.
And that might be the case. But my plea and Ed's plea is just be descriptive without necessarily labeling, unless you know. If you see a sign that says Greenwich, write Greenwich in your report. But if it just feels like Greenwich, then just describe the area as best you can.
Well, what I'm seeing here certainly is that there seems to be a huge amount of encouragement here towards the dream mosaic, and I think we need to flesh that one out a lot, to be frank about it. And that's certainly something that is, I think, generation 2 in terms of the model, because I need to sit down and think about how I want to do that. I do have some ideas in mind, but I wanted to get this thing out there, and hence I've just put a pretty prosaic kind of a form there for the moment. But from what you're saying there to me, I think it's very important that we do that. I think themes and structures and are very important, and a keyword search maybe to try and flag that. Maybe some kind of a software system that can identify similarities in the text. If we're using very everyday language, there's a possibility we could get somebody to scan that, and it could say, okay, let's say your experience is concurrent with somebody else's experience. Maybe you should look at that. It might direct you to it. It depends on the volume of traffic. I think for the moment a manual search will be adequate, but certainly once we start to build up activity, I've seen some of the lucid dream forums out there and they're very busy. And I think to be trolling through everybody's dream after a night would be a terribly laborious process. But I think what would be good would be some sort of word search. So for example, you might, be at a train station and you type in a train station and there you go, there's 3 other people, so they're also at a train station.
Right.
It would be worth reading their dreams. On the other hand, somebody who's at a beach at the same time, you might feel a little less encouraged, regardless of whether it was the same location or not.
Right.
So I think that's important, and that's certainly generation 2. A lot really to do with this. This, as I said, I'm very much saying this is a first day outing.
Good.
We don't know where this is going to take us.
Good.
And with the support of the community, certainly yourself, you've been hugely encouraging and certainly very inspiring with your work with Ed Kellogg, and Ed Kellogg likewise, who's been on the email to me. It's very much a case of if people support the project, if they share it, if they put it in their Facebook, their Twitter, and so on and so forth, and hopefully we'll get some mainstream media attention on it. I think that the mainstream media might find it somewhat comical in their own way, but I think that's encouraging enough for me to at least have them talk about it. I'd like to think that the national newspaper might pick up on the idea that some guy's trying to figure out if we can meet in dreams, and for them this just sounds terrifically funny. But the same people were dancing around the subject of lucid dreaming 5 or 6 years ago until certainly I think the film Inception came out, and suddenly everybody wanted to write a piece about lucid dreaming. Every magazine, every newspaper, they were scientifically critiquing it and so forth, saying this is a fact and these guys are doing it and it's very important.
Right.
And I think likewise here we're only dancing around the subject right now. We don't know where this is going to go. And I think just another little point there before we close up, and that is the idea that sometimes what you discover when you're looking for one thing, you discover something completely different. As an example, when scientists were researching the effect of galantamine on Alzheimer's patients, because of course it enhances memory and so forth, they discovered that it gave people lucid dreams, and now it has become a lucid dream supplement, not necessarily one that we encourage, but one that can be used to help people to learn to lucid dream and so forth. But the point is that it was inadvertently discovered the impact of galantamine on lucid dreaming, as opposed to somebody deciding that this might affect lucid dreaming. On the contrary. Right. So what stone we may yet uncover through this process of the mutual dream experiment has yet to be determined. It may be that we discover that mutual dreaming is possible, and so on and so forth, in a very linear fashion, but we may uncover something completely different. So I think the key here is open-minded, and to kind of come back to what you said from the outset, when we moved it out of our melancholic opening about the discussion of the meaningless world that we had discovered at the center of everything.
The world has meaning. Interconnected oneness, non-duality.
It's the Zen gets the better of me sometimes. I think the Zen guys get that a little bit. They get to this whole thing and they just get all very withdrawn about the whole thing.
And I think actually that's quite dangerous to take the characteristics of non-duality and
prescribe it to everyday life.
And prescribe it to everyday life.
I think it's a real mistake.
It should be exactly the opposite. And the interconnected oneness should elicit more creativity.
This, I think, is the conflict in conventional Buddhism, is whereby people have this notion that Zen is something that Buddhism stepped in, and they have a similar kind of a point of view. I think that they think that and I rarely use the term Zen Buddhism because I think they're quite different in many ways.
But the one area where this issue of interconnected oneness is important is what happened to me when I was on Lucipedia.com after Inception came out.
Yes.
A lot of the lucid dreamers there, if you go to Lucipedia.com, the advanced section, they were making fun of Inception and mutual lucid dreaming is crazy. And I said, no, it's not. It's not at all. And finally they got around to asking me to explain the mechanism. And I told them it was probably dream telepathy.
Right.
And they told me dream telepathy was nuts. And I said, okay, I'll put my money where my mouth is. I'll be the telepathic receiver. You find a telepathic sender. You have a gentleman get together 10 separate images.
Okay.
Give it to the telepathic sender, have him select one, and on that night, I will dream of what they're sending.
Wow, okay.
On that night, I had basically 5 dreams, and I posted them all before the target image was posted.
Yes, so that's
And so here I am as a new author taking an incredible risk.
Wow.
I mean,
this is back before you had actually...
This is about 4 years ago. My book had been out for a year.
Okay, you want to still be ready for a book, absolutely.
So I'm taking a big risk. All of my dreams were basically about cafes, food, people eating, cafes, food. I tried to leave the cafe, the road was blocked, and have to come back to the cafe. I put all my things, they reveal the target image, and it's a waitress in a restaurant delivering food to tables full of people. You can see the kind of chef and the thing there. And the guy who set up the experiment, this young Dutch guy, was totally blown away because he thought that this was fundamentally impossible and that anybody was a fool who would say that dream telepathy exists. So you can go there and read it, and of course they said, oh, it's beginner's luck, let's do it some more. So we did it about 5 or 6 more times, and after that you kind of get exhausted. And 5 or 6 more times it was also very convincing. But anyway, it exists out there. Anyone can read it. They can read my knowledge and thoughts about it. But what I want to get back to is this thing of interconnected oneness. If indeed from the very source there's an interconnected oneness, and if we exist as a collective unconscious, then that gives you some hope that this is actually achievable. That in a dream, someone can pass on to you a password and you can wake up with it. And probably your dream reports will share some characteristics. You might call it the Holy Land, I might call it a desert in Mexico, but at a structural level, anyone will be able to see, just like they could see in my reports when I'm talking about cafes, getting food, pictures of food, going back to the cafe, and then you see a woman there, you know. So I want to wish everyone the best with it, and I think it's great that you've set up this experiment just to get people thinking, because if you don't practice it, you'll never develop those kind of abilities, you'll never develop those kind of insights that'll lead you to a greater understanding of the true nature of reality.
Well, I very much appreciate you being here with me. You've been a huge inspiration, frankly, and as I said, it's been quite a revelation for the pair of us to have come out to each other about our non-dualistic awareness. I wasn't very, I didn't think we were going there, but there you are.
Yeah, there we go.
And I think, you know, to me, the word I want to close this on is creativity, because that's the key to everything, being creative. And being creative means recognizing that there are no boundaries other than the boundaries you create with your own imagination. And dreaming is exactly the place to dissolve those boundaries. Okay. So thank you very, very much as ever. Much appreciated.
Great, Rory.
And we'll speak again soon, no doubt.
Okay, thanks much.